Step out of the vehicle.
This is my assigned spot. I'm Agent Coleman, DHS.
I don't care what you call yourself. Move it now.
Officer Derek Brennan, 40 years old, 12 years with Colorado Springs Police Department. Agent Maya Coleman, 38, 14 years with the Department of Homeland Security, assigned parking spot for 3 years. A Monday morning, a federal lot, and 8 words that would cost Brennan 8 years in federal prison. Comment where in the world you're watching from and subscribe because tomorrow's story is one you can't afford to miss. What happened next would destroy one career and validate another. Derek Brennan had spent 12 years building a reputation in Colorado Springs. His supervisors called him decisive. His performance reviews noted assertiveness. He worked extra shifts, volunteered for patrol assignments others avoided, and kept his head down. On paper, he looked like the kind of officer departments valued. But internal files told a different story. 23 complaints of racial profiling sat in his record. 13 had been dismissed due to lack of evidence. 10 resulted in written warnings that went nowhere. The pattern was consistent. Brennan stopped black civilians in upscale neighborhoods, questioned their presence, asked for identification without cause. He challenged minority officers' credentials, demanded they prove their assignments, treated their authority as conditional. Supervisors noted the complaints, but rarely acted. Brennan was careful. He never used slurs. He phrased his questions as procedure. He documented his stops with language that sounded professional. And for years, it worked. 2 years earlier, Brennan's marriage had collapsed. The divorce left him living alone in a one-bedroom apartment on the east side of the city. He filled the silence with extra shifts, picking up overtime whenever he could. The house felt too empty. The weekends felt too long. Work became the only place where his authority felt intact. He had a son, 9 years old, living with his ex-wife across town. They had a custody arrangement, every other weekend, Wednesdays for dinner. Child support payments due on the 1st of each month, alimony on the 15th. Brennan's paycheck covered it, barely. The financial pressure weighed on him constantly. He thought about his son's birthday coming up in 3 weeks. He thought about the
camping trip they'd planned for summer. He thought about maintaining some version of stability in a life that felt increasingly unstable. Work was the one constant, the badge, the authority, the control, and he wasn't about to let someone challenge that. Maya Coleman had spent 14 years with the Department of Homeland Security. She specialized in immigration fraud investigations, the kind of cases that required patience, precision, and an ability to follow paper trails across state lines and international borders. She had dismantled 7 human trafficking rings. She had testified before the Senate Judiciary Committee on cross-border smuggling operations. Her file included commendations from 3 different field offices and a track record that spoke for itself. But Coleman's path to federal law enforcement hadn't been straightforward. Her mother had raised her alone from the age of 12, after Coleman's father, a police officer, was killed in the line of duty. He'd been responding to a domestic violence call. He'd been shot twice. He died before the ambulance arrived. Coleman had been in 7th grade. The funeral had been massive. Hundreds of officers, a flag-draped casket, a folded flag handed to her mother. Coleman had kept that flag in a frame on her wall for years. She'd kept her father's badge in a small wooden box, and she'd kept a photograph of him in uniform tucked inside her own badge holder, a reminder of why she'd chosen this work. Authority equals responsibility. That's what her father had told her. The badge wasn't just metal. It was a promise, a commitment, a standard. Coleman had carried that principle through her entire career. She didn't cut corners. She didn't abuse power. She didn't assume her authority made her untouchable. She earned respect by doing the work correctly. Her assigned parking spot had her name on it.
A small metal sign bolted to the concrete barrier. Agent M. Coleman. Federal personnel only. She'd parked there every workday for 3 years. Same spot, same routine. No issues. It was 7:42 a.m. on a Monday morning in early October. Coleman drove her black sedan into the
federal lot, the same way she had hundreds of times before. She approached her spot. Her badge sat visible on the dashboard, standard protocol. The federal building loomed ahead, its entrance marked with signage that made the property's jurisdiction clear. Brennan was already there, standing near the entrance to the lot, his patrol car parked at an angle that blocked part of the lane. He stepped into the path of Coleman's vehicle as she approached her spot.
Federal personnel only,
Brennan said, his tone firm, the kind that assumed compliance. Coleman pointed to the badge on her dashboard. Brennan walked closer, leaning slightly to peer through her windshield. "Anybody can fake those," he said. Coleman's voice remained level. "Check the registry. My name's on the list." Brennan straightened, his expression unchanging. "I don't need to check anything." What Coleman didn't know yet was that Brennan had done this before, 6 times, 6 different people. 5 had moved their cars without argument. 1 had filed a complaint that went nowhere. Brennan had learned how to push just hard enough to assert control without crossing a line clear enough to trigger serious consequences. But this time, he'd chosen the wrong person, and the consequences were about to become very real. Coleman sat in her car, engine still running, hands visible on the steering wheel. Brennan hadn't moved. He stood 3 feet from her driver's side window, his posture rigid, his expression set. He wasn't leaving, and Coleman realized this wasn't going to end with a simple clarification. Brennan leaned slightly toward the window. "You new here?" he asked, his tone carrying an edge that wasn't quite a question. "Most people in your position know better than to make this difficult." Coleman's response was immediate, her voice level but firm. "My position is senior agent. Yours is overstepping." Brennan straightened, his hand moving to the radio clipped to his shoulder. He didn't press the button. He didn't call dispatch. He just held it there, letting the implied threat hang in the air. "I can have backup here in 2 minutes," he said. Coleman
didn't flinch. "Call them. Ask for Captain Morris. He assigned this spot." Brennan's hand froze on the radio. 3 seconds passed. He didn't make the call. He lowered his hand. "Morris isn't here on Mondays," he said, as if that settled the matter. Coleman's expression didn't change. "Then check the federal database. I'll wait." Brennan's jaw tightened. For a moment, he seemed to consider her suggestion, but the consideration passed quickly. He wasn't interested in verification. He was interested in compliance. "People like you always play the victim card," he said, the words delivered with casual confidence, as if he'd said them before and gotten away with it. Coleman's tone dropped. The warmth, if there had been any, disappeared entirely. Her voice became clinical, precise, the kind of tone that made it clear she was no longer engaging in a conversation, but documenting one. "Define people like me, Officer Brennan." Silence. 5 seconds. Brennan didn't answer. His expression shifted slightly, uncertainty creeping in at the edges. He'd expected pushback, maybe anger, maybe defensiveness. He hadn't expected this. Coleman wasn't reacting emotionally. She was methodically dismantling his assumptions, one question at a time. Coleman opened her car door slowly, deliberately. She stepped out, her movements controlled, her posture firm but not aggressive. She didn't approach Brennan. She didn't need to. She stood beside her vehicle, her badge visible on her belt, her credentials clear. Brennan crossed his arms, a defensive gesture meant to reclaim authority. Then he uncrossed them. The uncertainty was showing now, subtle but present. He glanced at the federal building, at the signage marking the property, at Coleman's badge. He was recalculating. Coleman reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out her phone. She held it up, screen facing Brennan. "I'm recording this," her voice steady. "State your badge number." Brennan's expression hardened. "You don't have authority to." Coleman cut him off. "Federal law says I do." "Badge number." "Now." Brennan hesitated. The confidence he'd carried into this encounter was fracturing. He mumbled a response, barely audible. "What was that?" Coleman asked, her tone unchanged. "Badge."
4721, Brennan said, louder this time. Coleman repeated it clearly, enunciating each digit for the recording. "Badge 4721. Noted. The power dynamic had shifted. Brennan was no longer controlling the encounter. Coleman was, and she was doing it without raising her voice, without making threats, without escalating physically.
She was using procedure, documentation, and the law itself. The door to the federal building opened. A man in a dark suit stepped out, his badge visible on his belt. Agent Torres, 10-year veteran, Coleman's colleague. He took in the scene immediately. Coleman standing beside her car, Brennan positioned between her and her assigned spot. The tension unmistakable. "Maya, everything okay?" Torres called out, walking toward them. Coleman nodded once. "Officer Brennan is questioning my parking assignment." Torres stopped a few feet away, his gaze moving from Coleman to Brennan. "Her name's on the spot," Torres said, his tone matter-of-fact. "Check the board inside if you need confirmation." Brennan's jaw tightened further. "I don't need civilians telling me how to do my job." Torres didn't react to the dismissal. His response was calm, factual. "We're not civilians, we're federal agents, and you're on federal property." Brennan stood there, surrounded now by 2 federal agents, both calm, both professional, both making it clear he was the one out of line. He had 2 choices: apologize, step aside and walk away, or dig deeper, push harder, assert dominance he didn't actually have. For years, Brennan had chosen the second option and gotten away with it. This time would be different, but he didn't know that yet. He made his choice, and it would cost him everything. Brennan stepped closer. The distance between them narrowed to less than 2 feet. "I am detaining you for trespassing," he said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who believed procedure was on his side. Coleman's response came immediately. "On what grounds?" "I showed credentials." Brennan's hand moved to his belt, fingers brushing the handcuffs clipped there. "Suspicious behavior, failure to comply." Torres took a step forward. "Derek, don't. This is recorded. You're making a mistake." Brennan didn't look
At Torres. His focus stayed on Coleman. She hadn't moved. Her hands remained visible at her sides. No threat, no aggression, just stillness. "If you cuff me, Officer Brennan," Coleman said, her tone steady and clinical, "you are arresting a federal agent without cause on federal property. Confirm that's your intent." For a moment, Brennan paused. Ego versus reality. Years of unchecked authority versus the clarity of what Coleman had just said. His radio crackled, dispatch asking for his location. He ignored it. His hand closed around the cuffs. He pulled them free. He reached for Coleman's left wrist. She didn't resist. She stood still, exactly as she'd been standing. Brennan snapped one cuff around her wrist. Click. The sound was sharp, metallic, unmistakable. Torres's phone was still recording. Coleman's phone was still recording. And somewhere on the second floor of the federal building, another phone captured the entire scene. Brennan had just crossed a line he couldn't uncross. A car pulled into the lot, fast. The engine cut abruptly. A door slammed. Captain Morris, 50s, white, 28 years with Colorado Springs PD, strode toward them. His expression made it clear he already knew something had gone wrong. "Brennan, what the hell?" Morris's voice wasn't loud, but it carried weight. Brennan turned, still holding the cuff key in his hand. "Sir, this woman refused to—" Morris cut him off. "This woman is Agent Coleman. I assigned her this spot 3 years ago. Uncuff her. Now." Brennan's face drained of color. The certainty he'd carried into this encounter evaporated. Morris turned to Coleman, his tone shifting immediately. "I'm sorry, Agent Coleman." Coleman stood with one wrist still cuffed, her posture unchanged. "Captain, I need to file a formal complaint. Officer Brennan detained me without cause, ignored my credentials, and made racially charged remarks." Morris's jaw tightened. He turned back to Brennan. "Keys. Now." Brennan fumbled with the keys, his hand shaking as he unlocked the cuff. The metal fell away from Coleman's wrist. She rubbed the skin where the cuff had been, her gaze steady on Brennan. "That recording?" Coleman said.
holding up her phone. "It's already uploaded to cloud storage." Morris took a breath, the kind that indicated he was controlling his response. "Brennan, you're suspended pending investigation. Badge and weapon." Brennan's voice came out uncertain, defensive. "Sir, I was just—" Morris didn't let him finish. You just arrested a federal agent on federal property. Do you understand what you've done? Coleman's voice cut through the tension. I'll be filing with the DHS Office of Inspector General and the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division. Torres stepped forward. I'm a witness. I'll testify. Movement from the building caught Brennan's attention. A woman in a dark suit, white, mid-30s, another federal agent, stood near the entrance holding her phone up. She called out clearly, I recorded from the second floor, got everything. Brennan looked around. Evidence on 3 phones, witnesses surrounding him. His supervisor standing between him and any plausible defense. Authority figures confirming what he'd just done. There was no way out. Brennan reached for his badge with trembling fingers. He unclipped it from his belt and handed it to Morris. His voice cracked when he spoke. I have a kid. I can't lose this job. Coleman's response was cold, but not cruel. Factual, final. You should have thought about him before you put those cuffs on me. Morris took the badge, then held out his hand for Brennan's service weapon. Go home, Derek. Don't contact anyone involved in this incident. Brennan handed over the weapon. His hands were shaking visibly now. He walked toward his patrol car, each step heavier than the last. His mind raced. His son's birthday was in 3 weeks. They planned to go to the Science Museum. Alimony was due Friday. Child support on the 1st. The camping trip they talked about for summer. The custody arrangement he'd fought so hard to maintain. All of it suddenly felt fragile, precarious, dependent on a job he'd just destroyed in 8 minutes. In 48 hours, the life Brennan knew would collapse entirely. But the legal process had only just begun, 72 hours after Brennan handed over his badge.
By investigations launched simultaneously, the DHS Office of Inspector General, the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division, Colorado Springs Internal Affairs, digital evidence flooded in, Brennan's body cam, Torres's phone recording, the second-floor agent's video, Coleman's cloud-stored footage, 4 angles, 8 minutes, every word captured. Investigators ran Brennan's name through complaint databases. 23 prior complaints surfaced. The pattern became impossible to ignore. 18 of those 23 involved minorities. 14 of those 18 occurred in upscale areas. Black professionals questioned in parking lots. Minority officers challenged at building entrances. Civilians stopped in neighborhoods where their presence was deemed suspicious. 6 cases looked nearly identical to Coleman's. One from 2021 stood out. A black doctor, cuffed outside a hospital where he worked, detained for 20 minutes before a colleague confirmed his credentials. The city had settled quietly. $85,000, no admission of guilt. The complaint buried in Brennan's file. Investigators pulled Brennan's personnel records. 3 separate orders for mandatory racial bias training, none completed. Supervisors had noted the deficiency. No one had enforced it. The pattern wasn't just in Brennan's actions. It was in the department's failure to stop him. The Department of Justice announced federal charges: deprivation of rights under color of law, 18 U.S.C. Section 242, false arrest on federal property, obstruction of a federal officer. Each charge carried a potential sentence of up to 10 years. The state followed. The district attorney added charges of official misconduct and false imprisonment. Media coverage began locally. Colorado Springs news stations ran the story. Within 48 hours, CNN picked it up. Within a week, the body cam footage went viral. Millions of views, thousands of comments. The story became national. Coleman testified before a grand jury for 4 hours. Her tone remained calm, her details precise, her account devastating. She walked the jury through every moment. Brennan's refusal to verify her credentials, his dismissive language, the cuff clicking around her wrist. The grand jury deliberated for 2 hours. They indicted Brennan on all charges. The trial began 8 months later, 6 days in court. Brennan's defense attorney argued miscommunication, not malice, a misunderstanding that escalated
Beyond Brennan's intent. The prosecution didn't argue. They showed. Full body cam footage played in the courtroom. Then they brought in 6 prior victims. Each one described encounters nearly identical to Coleman's. Black professionals questioned without cause. Authority dismissed. Credentials ignored. The pattern undeniable. Coleman took the stand on day 4. Her testimony was measured, factual, devoid of emotion. He saw my badge. He saw my credentials. He saw federal property signs. He still chose to cuff me because he didn't believe a black woman could have that authority. The jury deliberated for 11 hours. They returned with a verdict: guilty on federal charges, deprivation of rights under color of law, false arrest. The judge scheduled sentencing for 2 weeks later. The courtroom was packed.
Brennan sat at the defense table, his expression blank. His ex-wife sat 3 rows back. Next to her, his son, now 10 years old, wearing a button-down shirt too big for his frame. The judge spoke clearly. This case represents an egregious abuse of power, a pattern of racial bias, and a violation of the oath you swore to uphold. 8 years in federal prison. No parole eligibility until year 6. Brennan's son started crying. Quiet at first, then louder. His mother wrapped her arm around him, guiding him out of the courtroom. Brennan watched them leave. He didn't turn around. After the sentencing, Coleman gave a brief statement outside the courthouse. This isn't about revenge. It's about accountability. My father died wearing a badge with honor. Officer Brennan dishonored that badge. Brennan's ex-wife filed for full custody modification within a week. Granted. His pension, earned over 12 years, was revoked. Legal fees totaled $127,000. His house went into foreclosure 4 months later. Coleman continued her work with DHS. She also began training officers on civil rights and federal law, traveling to departments across the country, turning her experience into education. Authority without accountability becomes abuse. One decision can cost everything. 8 years, 2,920 days, all because of 8 minutes, when ego overrode judgment. 1 parking spot. 8 years in federal prison. Brennan had a choice.
De-escalate, apologize, walk away. Instead, he chose ego. He chose cuffs. He chose conviction. Coleman had a choice too. Document, stand firm, trust the system. She chose all 3. The result was justice served. The impact extended beyond one case. The body cam footage became training material in 47 police academies nationwide, a clear example of what not to do. Colorado Springs Police Department implemented mandatory bias training for all officers, no exceptions. 3 officers from Brennan's precinct were fired after their complaint histories were reviewed and similar patterns emerged. Your authority ends where someone else's rights begin. One decision defines you. Brennan chose wrong. Coleman chose dignity, preparation, and law. She's still serving. If you believe no badge is above the law, subscribe. Tomorrow's story involves a dirty cop who planted evidence on the wrong person. What happened next will shock you.